The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Megan O'Brien pushed the med cart down the corridor of Mercy General's ICU, her movements precise and economical like someone accustomed to working in spaces where every gesture mattered. 3 weeks into this position, and she had learned the rhythm of the Portland hospital the way a musician learns a new instrument, not by studying it, but by becoming part of its pulse. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, that particular combination that lived in every intensive care unit from San Diego to Seattle, and her shoes whispered against the polished tile without urgency. Nobody rushed here. Rushing meant panic, and panic meant mistakes, and mistakes meant people died in rooms like these. She approached ICU bed 7 without ceremony, checking the vitals of the man in the comatose state who'd been her assignment since day one. Commander Thomas Hayes, the name on the chart said, though she recognized something in the angular shape of his face, the particular way his left hand rested on the blanket. 20 years was a long time for a memory to surface, longer still for it to arrive with the weight of something she'd tried to bury. His oxygen saturation was stable at 94%. Heart rate steady at 68. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in and out, keeping him tethered to a life that had no visitors, no flowers, no evidence that anyone beyond the medical system remembered he existed. Megan's fingers found his radial pulse without hesitation, counting beats with the kind of automatic precision that came from muscle memory older than her civilian career. Her hands moved like surgical instruments, steady and practiced, completing in 12 seconds what would take most of the newer nurses 2 minutes of searching. The tremor in her left hand, the souvenir from a field hospital in Helmand Province, vanished the moment she engaged in work. Only in idle moments, when she was charting or waiting, did the tremor announce itself, a small betrayal of something she'd learned to ignore years ago. Her jacket hung in the locker at the end of the hall, canvas and weathered, the kind of thing that looked like it came from a thrift store in northeast Portland. The unit patch sewn into the lining was barely visible, thread-thin stitching that held a piece of fabric from another life. She'd sewn it herself during a night shift for years ago, understanding without admitting it that the patch needed to stay close but hidden, the way some people keep photographs in their wallets of people they've stopped talking about. The ICU opened onto the central nurses' station like a stage, and that's where Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood, barrel-chested and loud, surveying his domain with the posture of someone who'd long ago confused authority with competence. He was 53 years old, though the expensive watches and tailored suits made him seem younger to people who didn't look closely. He was looking closely at Megan as she moved between beds 7 and 8, noting the steadiness of her hands as she performed a peripheral for placement on the post-op patient in bed 8, noting how the needle found the vein on the first attempt, how she secured the catheter and labeled it without hesitation or ceremony. Hargrove's eyes narrowed in a way that made the nurses around him shift slightly, the way animals shift when a predator changes its posture. He'd been chair of the cardiothoracic department for 7 years, long enough to cultivate the kind of institutional power that doesn't appear in any formal document. 3 board members owed him favors. 2 insurance adjusters took his calls before anyone else's. A state licensing official's daughter had received help with medical school debt in a way that created the kind of obligation that lasted decades. He'd built something durable, something that would survive scrutiny and weather difficulty, something that allowed him to move through Mercy General like a man who'd internalized his own untouchability. What he hadn't internalized yet was that the quiet nurse with the downcast eyes and the apologetic way of moving through hallways had noticed the billing codes 3 days ago. Megan had been reviewing charts for Commander Hayes, cross-referencing his cardiology consultations with actual notes in the medical record, when she found the pattern. 3 consultations billed to his account at $500 each, no corresponding documentation in the record. No notes from the consulting cardiologist. No EKG results, no echocardiogram orders, nothing. Just line items in the billing system, neat and clean and entirely phantom. She'd flagged it as an anomaly in her mind, the way she'd been trained to flag anomalies in patient vitals, something that shouldn't be there, something that needed investigation. Then she'd seen Commander Hayes's chart cross-referenced with 17 other accounts from the past 6 weeks, all with the same pattern. All with the same cardiologist listed. All with documentation that didn't exist. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Asking questions at a new job was a liability, and she'd learned long ago the value of silence. Hargrove moved toward the nurse's station at approximately 2 o'clock that afternoon, when the shift change was still 2 hours away and the unit had that particular exhausted quality that came before dinner rush. The nurses scattered slightly, that was instinctive when Hargrove entered a space. He had a way of making rooms feel smaller. He pulled out a chair with an unhurried gesture and settled into it with his arms crossed, surveying the staff with an expression that suggested he was about to announce something consequential. "New nurse," he said, his voice carrying across the station without effort. "The quiet one. O'Brien." Megan continued charting, her pen moving in careful notation across the medication administration record. She didn't look up. Looking up was a form of engagement, and engagement might invite attention, and attention was something she'd learned to avoid with the same discipline other people applied to dieting. "I'm going to make a prediction," Hargrove continued, and the station went quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. "I think our new colleague will find that the pace of this unit doesn't suit her. I think she'll discover that nursing at Mercy General requires a particular kind of fortitude that not everyone possesses." He paused, letting the words settle like sediment. "In fact, I'm confident enough in my assessment to make a wager. 1 week. That's how long I give her before she walks out those doors and doesn't come back." The silence that followed was the kind of silence where you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing their electric hymn, where you could hear the distant mechanical breathing of ventilators, where you could hear the very particular sound of professional ambition being tested in front of an audience. Megan finished her notation. She set the pen down with careful precision and turned a page in the chart, still not looking toward Hargrove or his audience. Her jaw tightened in a way that was invisible unless you were looking for it, and she wasn't the kind of person anyone had learned to look for yet. But her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She understood, with the clarity of someone who'd survived situations that required actual survival, that Hargrove was establishing a hierarchy. He was announcing to the unit that the new nurse was expendable, temporary, not worth integration into the professional community. It was a small cruelty, the kind that preceded larger ones. It was also the kind of thing she'd learned not to respond to. "Anyone want to match that bet?" Hargrove looked around the station with what might have been a smile. "I'll give 2-to-1 odds she's gone by next Friday." No one volunteered to take the wager. Betting against the department chair was a career-limiting move, and everyone at the station understood that the department chair was someone whose favor mattered in ways both obvious and subtle. The shift in the room was almost physical, the way everyone's attention seemed to contract away from Megan and toward the business of their charts and computers. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Megan still hadn't looked up, hadn't given any indication that she'd heard the prediction, the public articulation of her temporary status. She turned another page. She reviewed another medication order. She existed in her own small space of work and silence as if the words had passed through her without landing. Later, when she stepped out to the supply room to gather wound dressings, her hands tremored for exactly 8 seconds before steadying again against the plastic storage bins. She breathed in through her nose, counting the exhale the way she'd been trained to do during medical training that had taken place in contexts nobody here would ever know about. The tremor subsided. The breathing settled. She gathered the dressings and returned to her station without anyone noticing that she'd been gone at all. What Hargrove didn't know, what nobody at Mercy General knew, was that the quiet nurse with the steady hands and the apologetic demeanor had survived situations that made losing a job feel like a footnote in a longer story. What he didn't know was that she'd spent 12 years as a senior chief petty officer, embedded with Marine units in places like Marja and Sanjan Valley, performing procedures in field hospitals that made civilian medicine look like a luxury. What he didn't know was that she'd already died once, not literally, but bureaucratically, her service records classified and sealed and officially erased by Pentagon lawyers who understood the value of certain people ceasing to exist officially. But none of that was relevant yet. What was relevant was that she'd noticed the billing irregularities, and Hargrove's public bet meant he was either confident enough to ignore her observation or nervous enough to preemptively establish her unreliability. Either way, she understood with cold clarity that this job was already ending. She just didn't know yet that it would end in a way that would bring down everything Hargrove had built. The tray crashed to the floor 3 days later. Megan had learned the rhythms of Mercy General's cafeteria by her third week, the fluorescent strips casting everything in a bluish pallor, the steam tables where chicken rotated on spits, the hum of the industrial dishwasher underneath it all. She moved through the lunch line on autopilot, her mind still on the billing codes she'd been reviewing during her break. Phantom consultations. Procedures that didn't match treatments. All of them tied to Dr. Hargrove's name. She didn't see him until his foot hooked the table leg. The collision was deliberate, the timing too precise to be accident. Soup splattered across her scrubs. The plate shattered on the tile, sending ceramic shards spinning like shrapnel. Her sandwich landed face down in the spreading orange stain. The cafeteria went still. Every conversation paused. Every eye turned toward the spill, then toward her, then toward Hargrove sitting at the adjacent table, his phone still in his hand, his attention apparently unmoved. "Clumsy, aren't we?" He said it without looking up, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest tables to catch it. Megan crouched. The cold tile bit into her knees as she reached for broken ceramic, her hands moving with precision, gathering each shard like evidence. The muscles in her shoulders, the ones that had held lives together in a burning Humvee, that had performed cricothyrotomies in sandstorms, that had carried wounded men across deserts, those muscles did not shake. Her breathing remained even. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. One measured breath. She picked up every piece. Stacked the shards carefully in her palm, cradled them like they mattered. The entire cafeteria watched. She could feel their discomfort the way soldiers feel the weight of eyes in a marketplace, that specific, electric awareness of being observed by people who don't know what to do with what they're seeing. She didn't speak. She stood, disposed of the broken ceramic in the trash bin, cleaned the soup from the tile with a paper towel, and carried on to the exit without changing her pace. But the damage was done. Not to her. To Hargrove's strategy. The following week had taught him something crucial. Whatever he'd expected from a new nurse, Megan O'Brien wasn't it. His public bet in the nurses' station had gathered an audience, but no witnesses to her breaking. The cafeteria incident had been witnessed by 12 staff members, and in that silence after, he'd seen something flicker across her face, not hurt, not fear, but a kind of patient calculation that made his jaw tighten. So he escalated. The patient hallway. The one outside the ICU where the nurses documented medication administration and revised treatment plans. That's where he threw the chart at her feet. She was reaching for the medication log when his shadow fell across the counter. The paper scattered across the tile in a rough fan, some sliding beneath the medication cart, others fluttering to rest at her shoes. For people were within sight, 3 doctors and a resident whose name Megan had never learned. All of them froze. None of them moved. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His voice had the texture of someone accustomed to obedience, the kind of tone that worked on medical students and residents who feared their evaluations. "And when you're done playing nurse, maybe check if you actually charted those meds you claim you gave." Megan crouched. Her knees didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake as she gathered the scattered pages, reassembling them with methodical care. The paper was cheap, the kind that creased easily, and she smoothed each page as she collected it. Her breathing remained steady. The single tear that escaped her left eye moved like deliberate choreography, precise and controlled, and when she wiped it away without breaking eye contact, the 3 watching doctors exchanged glances that meant something. Something that made Hargrove's expression harden into something uglier. She stood. The reassembled chart felt solid in her hands. She turned, and when she met Hargrove's eyes, her voice came out with the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. The medications were administered at 0600, 1200, and 1800. Every word was clipped, each one a period. Exactly as ordered. Exactly as documented. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Hargrove's face flushed purple, the color climbing his neck like fire spreading through a structure. He snatched the chart from her hands, turned on his heel, and walked away, his gait stiff with the fury of a man unaccustomed to being corrected by anyone he considered beneath him. Behind him, one of the doctors whispered something to the others, and Megan caught the fragment, insurgents, and understood that her words had carried further than she intended. That night, she sat alone in the ICU during her break. Commander Daniel Hayes lay in bed 7, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision, the ventilator providing each breath. He had been unconscious for 6 weeks. The medical chart said it was from complications of a trauma wound, properly treated, properly documented. But Megan had started reviewing his records with the precision she'd once applied to combat casualty care, and what she found in those old VA notes didn't match the current imaging reports. There was supposed to be a follow-up CT scan to evaluate for retained shrapnel near his left lung, a fragment that had been noted during his initial treatment but never fully removed. That scan had never been ordered. The notation had simply disappeared from the recent charts. She touched his arm. The old burn scar was still there, the tissue raised and discolored, marking a memory from 20 years ago when the Humvee flipped and the world became fire. She was younger then, a corpsman attached to his unit, and he was just Private Hayes, terrified and screaming and burning. She dragged him out through the broken window, her own hands blistering from the heat, feeling the flesh of his arm stick to hers as she pulled him clear of the flames. "I got you out then, Danny." Her voice was barely above a whisper, barely audible over the ventilator's mechanical rhythm. "I'm still here." She didn't know if he could hear her. The neurologist said probably not at this stage of unconsciousness. But she'd held enough dying men to understand that sometimes the body remembers even when the brain doesn't listen. The next morning, she'd written up a request for new chest imaging. Clean handwriting. Clear clinical justification. Everything by protocol. Within an hour, Hargrove appeared in the ICU nurse's station like a storm materializing without warning, his voice dropping to a register that made other staff members find sudden tasks elsewhere in the facility. "You don't order imaging without my approval." Each word came out like a physical object, something with weight and edges. "You don't question treatment protocols. You're a nurse, not a doctor." He ripped the request form in half. The sound of tearing paper carried further than it should have. He slid a typed document across the desk toward her, and Megan read the header, Employee Disciplinary Form, Conduct Violation. The allegations were lies. Missed medications. Late charting. Insubordination. Every claim fabricated with surgical precision. She understood then that Hargrove wasn't trying to break her composure anymore. He was building a termination case. And he was doing it fast, which meant he knew something. He knew she'd found something. That evening, from her car in the parking lot, she watched him on the phone in his private office visible through the third-floor windows. The rain hammered the windshield like applause, obscuring her view until his silhouette moved, the angle of his body suggesting fury and calculation in equal measure. She would learn later, much later, after everything collapsed, that he made 3 calls that night. The first to a hospital board member whose company Hargrove had steered a $847,000 supply contract toward, someone who owed him the kind of favor that came due without asking. The second to a private investigator whose rate was $2,500 per day, instructed to dig into Megan O'Brien's employment history with particular attention to the gap before 3 years ago. "There's nothing." "Find out why," Hargrove had said, and those simple words set in motion a series of inquiries that would eventually hit classified walls and bounce back with nothing but silence. The third call was to a state licensing official whose daughter's medical school debt had been mysteriously forgiven, $184,000 that suddenly vanished from her account when a single anonymous payment cleared a trust fund. "I need her credentials reviewed. Thoroughly. I suspect falsification." He was activating every connection he'd cultivated over 20 years, every favor banked and waiting, calling in debts with the confidence of someone who'd never learned that some people couldn't be pressured and some debts couldn't be collected. At 2 a.m., Megan sat alone in the ICU. The monitor beside Commander Hayes's bed showed a steady sinus rhythm, each beat marking time, marking nothing changing. She held her notebook in her lap, the one where she documented the phantom consultations, the billing codes that didn't match the clinical work performed, the procedures listed under the commander's name that had never actually happened. $43,000 in fraudulent billings over 6 months. Maybe more. She'd only reviewed back that far before Hargrove's escalation had demanded her full attention. She slipped the notebook into the inner pocket of her jacket where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining. The patch was old, pre-year 9-11 old, fabric softened by decades, embroidered with a call sign that nobody in this hospital would recognize. The call sign she'd earned in a desert that no longer existed on any map, for operations that had been officially erased from the record. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical rhythm, constant and unchanging, like a heartbeat that never slowed. Outside, the rain continued. And in his office, Dr. Hargrove was already drafting the paperwork that would end her employment. He had no idea that he'd just put his hand on a wire carrying 17,000 volts. The ICU was quiet at 11:15 that evening, the kind of quiet that happens after the day's shift scrambles out and the night team settles into their rhythms. Mercy General's 7th floor held only 4 occupied beds, sensors so low that the fluorescent panels above the empty rooms had been dimmed to save power. Megan finished her charting at the central station, initiating the last round of vital signs, checking the hemodynamic monitors that beeped their steady rhythm into the darkness. She'd been awake for 16 hours straight, picked up the overnight shift to avoid sitting at home where her 13-year-old son would ask questions she couldn't answer about why his mother looked like she'd been hit by something. The walking felt different now. 3 weeks at Mercy General had taught her the geography of the building, the ICU layout, which floors had better coffee, where the supply closets kept extra pillows, which vending machine actually took bills instead of eating them. Old muscle memory from a different life, a different uniform, a different name in a different file cabinet somewhere in the Pentagon. But the walking itself felt lighter lately, as if her body was remembering how to move through the world without carrying quite so much weight. She paused outside bed 7. The man inside was 53 years old according to his chart, though his face looked older, the kind of aging that came from carrying things that shouldn't be carried. Commander Michael Hayes, USMC retired, admitted 4 days ago with complications from old shrapnel wound, thoracic region, major operational theater, classified incident, no further detail. His right side was wrapped tight, bandages covering the entry point of a wound that had tried to kill him 2 decades ago and apparently wasn't done trying. Megan stood in the doorway. The monitor above his bed painted everything in soft green glow. His oxygen saturation was steady at 94, heart rate calm at 62, blood pressure normal. Sleeping. The kind of sleep that came to people whose bodies had learned to rest in the sound of artillery, the kind of rest that could be interrupted by nothing and everything simultaneously. She shouldn't have gone in. Protocol was simple, charting done, break taken, medication pass at midnight, then the long dark hours until 7 a.m. But something in her chest made her step into the room anyway, made her close the door softly behind her, made her pull a chair beside the bed and sit where the camera in the corner couldn't quite see clearly. His right hand lay on top of the blanket, palm down. She could see the scar tissue, pink and white, puckered, the kind of scarring that came from surgical reconstruction and time and the body's best effort to seal itself back together after violence. She'd seen that scar before. Not on this man, but on a different version of him, younger, terrified, bleeding through a combat medic's pressure bandage in the back of a Humvee rolling at 40 miles an hour toward a forward operating base outside Marja with insurgent fire chasing the vehicle across the dust. 20 years. 2 decades. She reached out slowly and touched the scar tissue with the tip of one finger, just barely, the way you might touch something that still burns though the fire went out years ago. She knew who he was. Not from the chart. From the shape of his breathing. From the way his body held tension even in sleep. From the specific geography of his wounds. Private Michael Hayes, attached to Charlie Platoon, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, had been 23 years old when a roadside device turned his Humvee into a furnace. She'd pulled him from the burning vehicle, dragged him into the dust, applied direct pressure to the entrance wound, called in the medevac, held his hand while the rotor wash of the Black Hawk helicopter threw sand and blood and prayer into the air around them. He'd looked at her then with the kind of fear that came from believing you were about to die. She'd look back at him with the kind of calm that came from having already decided you wouldn't. Now, 20 years later, he slept in bed 7 while she sat beside him in the dark ICU of a hospital in Portland, Oregon, 3,000 miles from Marja, and they didn't acknowledge that they knew each other because knowing each other couldn't exist in any official capacity. Her service records had been erased. His file was classified. The mission that had connected them was buried so deep in Pentagon files that it had effectively stopped existing. She was nobody who had saved someone who wasn't supposed to need saving on a day that had never happened. Megan withdrew her hand and stood. The monitor continued its steady beeping. His oxygen saturation remained perfect. His heart rate calm. Everything was fine. Everything was completely fine and stable and normal, and there was no reason for the small cold place in her chest that was waiting for something to break. She moved back toward the door, back toward charting, back toward the normal rhythm of the night shift. She had 90 minutes until her medication pass. She had the rest of her life to not acknowledge that she was sitting in a hospital watching a man she'd pulled from fire 20 years ago to make sure he didn't need pulling from fire again. At 2:47 a.m., the monitor alarm sounded. Not the soft alerting sound. The emergency sound. The sound that meant the numbers had crossed into the territory where bodies stop working and you have minutes to convince them otherwise. Megan's eyes opened before she was fully aware she'd been sleeping in the break room, head on the table, coffee long cold beside her, 3 weeks of Hargrove's humiliation and the weight of pretending to be nobody finally catching up. She was moving before her brain registered the location. Bed 7. ICU monitoring system shrieking its red alert into the quiet night. She hit the ICU floor at a run, pulled the glass door open, and stepped into Commander Hayes' room to find his eyes open and panicked and his chest working too hard. The monitors told the story in numbers. Oxygen saturation 89 and dropping. Heart rate 138. Blood pressure creeping up as his body fought something it couldn't see. She moved to the bedside, her eyes scanning, her hands already assessing. His neck, the jugular veins were distended, turgid, pushed outward with pressure building inside the chest cavity. His breathing was labored, asymmetrical. She placed her stethoscope on his right chest wall and heard nothing. Silence where breath sounds should live. Tension pneumothorax. The old shrapnel wound, the one that had been wrapped and healed and declared stable for 20 years, had finally shifted. Something in the scar tissue had weakened. Something in the old trauma had decided that surviving wasn't finished yet. The punctured lung had collapsed, air was bleeding into the pleural space, pressure building with every breath, compressing the heart, crushing the vessels, making it impossible for his body to move blood or oxygen or anything except the slow machinery of dying. O2 Sat 86. Megan hit the code button. Her fingers moved across the communication panel, activating the overhead announcement, the emergency page, the hospital-wide alert that brings physicians running or walking or stumbling depending on where they were and what they were doing. She kept her voice steady, reporting the vitals, the clinical presentation, the assessment of a tension pneumothorax requiring emergency decompression. 84. The first physician appeared in the doorway within 90 seconds. Dr. Patterson, the senior resident on call. Megan saw him, saw the moment he recognized the emergency, saw the moment his eyes shifted to something over her shoulder. She turned to follow his gaze and saw Dr. Hargrove standing at the nurse's station 30 feet away, shaking his head slowly, deliberately, his expression carrying instructions written in body language that was impossible to misread. Patterson turned and walked back toward the elevators. Megan didn't waste time processing that decision. She turned back to the monitor. 82. She initiated supplemental oxygen, increased the flow rate, moved to prepare for the procedure that was coming whether physicians arrived or not. The code announcement had gone out. The hospital was responding. Dr. Chen arrived next, a second-year fellow with steady hands and the kind of composure that comes from never having had to make impossible decisions. Megan watched her step toward the doorway, watched her phone light up with an incoming call, watched her look at the screen, look at Hargrove, step back into the hallway, answer her phone with false urgency. 80. The next physician came in wearing a surgical cap still damp from the shower, Dr. Martinez, the trauma surgeon on backup. He looked at the monitor readout, looked at Megan, looked toward the nurse's station where Hargrove stood with his arms crossed, and Megan heard him say something to his companion in the hallway that she couldn't quite hear except for the final phrase delivered with enough volume to carry. The nurse can handle it. 78. One by one they arrived. Dr. Okonkwo, Dr. Steinberg, Dr. Patel, Dr. Kim, Dr. Rosenberg, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Wallace, Dr. Brooks, Dr. DeMarco. 12 physicians total, summoned by the emergency alert, arriving through the ICU doors with varying degrees of medical urgency and professional obligation, each one pausing in the doorway, each one recognizing the crisis, each one finding a reason not to enter the room. A phone call. A page. A sudden realization that they were needed elsewhere. A conversation with a colleague that required their immediate attention. One by one, they turned and walked away while Megan stood beside a dying man and watched the oxygen saturation drop. 75. She could hear Hargrove's voice now, loud enough to carry down the hallway, deliberately pitched for impact. The insubordinate nurse seems to think she knows better than physicians. Let her demonstrate her competence. The contempt in his tone was precise, surgical, designed to accomplish exactly what it accomplished. It gave 12 doctors permission to abandon their patient. It transformed a medical emergency into a professional protest, a power play, a test of whether this quiet nurse who'd been here 3 weeks would finally break. 72. Megan's hand trembled. Not from fear. From something deeper, something that lived in muscle memory from another life, from training that had taught her that the tremor wasn't weakness, it was restraint, the physical manifestation of every instinct screaming at her to move, to act, to do what needed doing, held back by years of protocol and procedure and the careful necessity of not revealing what lived underneath the surface. She breathed. One measured breath. Then another. The tremor stopped. She moved to the supply cart and pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from its sterile package. The wrapper crinkled in the quiet room, the only sound besides the dying rhythm of the monitor. She felt the years fall away, the hospital uniform, the civilian identity, the pretense that she was just a nurse on her 3rd week at Mercy General. Underneath it all was still Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, who'd performed emergency needle decompression in the back of a Humvee while a Marine private bled through her hands, who'd trained for combat medicine through for operational deployments across a theater where the only choice was to act or watch people die. She palpated the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were exactly where they were supposed to be. She could feel the bony ribs beneath her fingertips, could identify the space between them with a kind of precision that came from having done this exact procedure 100 times in 100 different environments, on 100 different patients, in the kinds of conditions where hesitation meant death. Her hands were absolutely steady. She pushed the needle through skin and muscle, through the fascia, into the pleural space with a controlled motion that had no doubt in it, no questioning, no awareness of the 12 physicians standing frozen in the hallway or the sound of Dr. Hargrove's breathing stopping somewhere behind her. The needle penetrated the membrane. The hiss of released pressure filled the room, air that had been crushing the lungs and the heart and the vessels all escaping in a single moment of decompression, the distinctive sound of a chest cavity returning to negative pressure, the immediate audible confirmation that the procedure had worked. 75. 81. 87. 92. The monitor climbed. The oxygen saturation rose with each second as the collapsed lung re-expanded, as the heart stopped being compressed, as the vessels opened back up and the body remembered how to move blood and oxygen again. Commander Hayes's breathing eased. His shoulders dropped away from his ears. The panic in his eyes shifted into shock and something that looked almost like recognition. The room went completely silent except for the monitor's steady rhythm, the gentle beeping of vitals returning to normal, the sound of a man who should have been dead 5 minutes ago still breathing. Megan maintained pressure on the needle, keeping the pathway open, her hands moving through the next steps of the procedure with the automatic precision of muscle memory. She was aware of the 12 physicians standing in the hallway. She was aware of Dr. Hargrove's face going white, then red, the color of a man watching his carefully constructed power structure collapse in real time. She was aware of his hand moving to his phone, pulling it out, beginning to dial while his eyes stayed locked on hers through the ICU glass. But mostly she was aware of a man in bed 7, who was alive because she'd never stopped being who she was underneath the scrubs and the 3-week employment history. The hiss filled the room like a pressure valve releasing on an engine that had been running too hot for too long. The needle slid into the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and the air came out in that distinctive rush, the sound of life returning. O'Brien's hands moved with the muscle memory of 100 battlefield procedures, and her eyes never left the monitor. 72%. 78. 84. The commander's chest rose and fell with actual air now, not the suffocating draw of a collapsed lung. Sinus rhythm. Steady. His blood pressure began climbing back into the realm of survival. She taped the needle in place with practiced efficiency, her movements precise as a surgeon's, and exhaled once, the kind of breath that comes after you've pulled someone back from the edge of nothing. She'd done this before. She'd done this in the dark with insurgent fire walking rounds across the hood of a Humvee. This was quieter. This was Portland. But the hands that held steady had held a lot of hands over 20 years, and they didn't forget their training. The intercom crackled somewhere down the corridor. She could hear the speaker in her bones, that institutional tone, code blue, ICU. Multiple physicians responding. She heard them coming before she saw them, the footsteps, the raised voices, the momentum of a medical emergency that pulled every available trauma surgeon toward bed 7 like gravity itself had shifted. 12 doctors. She counted them as they arrived at the doorway, all summoned by emergency alert, all moving with the controlled urgency that said they were ready to intervene. She looked up from the monitor, expecting the cavalry. Expecting hands that would take over. Expecting the weight to lift. Instead, she watched them stop at the threshold. One by one. Like they'd hit an invisible wall. The first doctor, trauma surgery, she recognized him from the cafeteria, paused, looked past her into the room, and then stepped backward. His hand made a small gesture, half apology, half surrender. The second doctor arrived moments later, took in the scene, made eye contact with someone behind the cluster, and turned away without a word. Then the third. Fourth. Fifth. They came like a procession, like pallbearers realizing they'd brought the wrong casket, and each one retreated with the same choreographed precision. She could see Dr. Hargrove standing at the ICU station, his phone already down, his expression arranged into something that looked concerned but felt like victory. She watched him make eye contact with each arriving physician. Watched his chin dip slightly. A gesture. An instruction. The insubordinate nurse can handle it. Those words didn't need to be spoken. They hung in the air like cigarette smoke, poisoning every professional obligation in the room. 12 doctors. 12 refusals. 12 moments where the cascade of abandonment became something she could measure and document. She didn't look at any of them. She kept her eyes on the monitor, on the commander's chest rise and fall, on the numbers that said he was alive because she'd acted while everyone else had hesitated at a doorway. The silence became so thick she could feel its weight, the kind of silence that only happens in rooms full of people making a collective choice to ignore their oaths. The last doctor, a cardiologist whose name she didn't know, lingered slightly longer than the others, his jaw working, his eyes moving between her and Hargrove. She watched him calculate. Watched him decide. He left anyway. The room emptied. The footsteps retreated. The commander's vitals climbed higher, and Megan documented everything with the precision of someone who'd been trained to keep records that might matter to tribunals. Time of deterioration. Vital sign trajectory. Absent physician response. Nature of intervention. Patient outcome. Her handwriting was military steady, which was to say it didn't shake, didn't waver, didn't betray the thermometer rising in her chest. She knew what was coming. She'd known it the moment Hargrove activated his phone. 90 minutes. That's how long he'd need to make the calls. The first call came from a man named Bennett, board member, real estate developer, someone whose clinic had somehow received $180,000 in hospital referrals over the past 18 months. The second call went to a woman named Sterling, whose medical school debt had mysteriously been forgiven 3 years ago through a non-profit funded by sources Meghan could now guess at with absolute certainty. The third call was placed to a state licensing official named Prescott, whose daughter's law school tuition had apparently been subsidized by institutional grants that materialized out of nowhere. Meghan didn't know these specifics yet, but she understood the mechanism. She'd seen networks like this before. Corruption moved like water, finding cracks, filling spaces, making everything around it complicit. All Hargrove had to do was pull the strings he'd already woven into place. Security arrived at 2:48 p.m. 3 guards and the chief nursing officer, whose face had been carefully arranged into an expression of administrative regret. They didn't come to congratulate her. They came with a manila folder and voices that had already decided something. "Ms. O'Brien, we need you to come with us." Not a request. It was the kind of tone used for suspects and terminated employees. She stood, set down the patient chart, and followed them out of the ICU with her composure intact and her pulse steady as a metronome. The conference room smelled like expensive coffee and furniture Polish. 3 administrators sat on one side of the table. Hargrove sat in the corner with crossed arms and an expression of vindication. They slid the termination letter across the polished mahogany surface. Falsified credentials. Unauthorized medical procedures outside scope of practice. Gross insubordination. She read it silently, every line an accusation that wasn't quite a lie but wasn't quite the truth either. She'd saved a life. That was the procedure. The credentials, those were the problem. Because the credentials that mattered, the ones that would prove her competence, the ones that carried the weight of a Navy Cross and 2 Purple Hearts, had been systematically erased 13 years ago by people with more power than anyone in this room could imagine. "My credentials are valid," she said, her voice level as calm water. That man would be dead without intervention. 12 physicians refused to provide care. The CNO looked uncomfortable. Guilt settled into the lines around her eyes. "Dr. Hargrove has documented a pattern of concerning behavior," she said carefully. "And when we attempted to verify your employment history beyond 3 years ago, there's nothing. No nursing school records. No previous employers. No references. We have investigators looking into identity fraud." Meghan's face didn't change. Her hands clenched once beneath the table, a single moment of pressure that released immediately. She couldn't explain. The classified operation in Marja that had gone sideways, the Pentagon had buried it completely, erased her service records, ordered her to disappear so thoroughly that no one could connect her to the mission that officially never happened. Senior Chief Petty Officer O'Brien had ceased to exist when those Pentagon lawyers filed their final papers. She'd signed documents, taken oaths, agreed to be unmade so that the men she'd served with could stay alive, could have futures, could exist in a world where the things that happened in that valley never touched the surface of official record. She had no defense she was allowed to speak. No medals she could produce. No rank she could invoke. She had only silence and composure and the knowledge that the commander in Bed 7 was alive because of choices she'd made long before she became invisible. "I have nothing further to say," she told them, and meant it the way soldiers mean things, as a statement of fact that won't change regardless of circumstances. Security escorted her out through the main corridor at exactly 3 p.m. Staff watched from nursing stations and medication carts. Some looked away. Others whispered. Hargrove stood at the ICU window, watching her leave, his expression arranged into something that looked like professional satisfaction but felt like something much darker. The afternoon sun hit the glass doors as she passed through them, and for a moment she was just another person leaving a hospital, except she was the one person who couldn't ever return to the identity she'd been trying to build. That evening, Meghan sat at her kitchen table. Her 13-year-old son's homework, algebra, a history essay on the American Revolution, something about analyzing primary sources, was spread across the surface like evidence of a normal life. She stared at the pages without reading them. Her hands lay flat on the table. She was still composed. She was still calm. But something in her chest had cracked, and she didn't know how to close it back up. Not yet. Not when everything she'd sacrificed to become invisible had just been used as a weapon. Tyler came home at 5:31 p.m., surprised to find her there. The front door opened with its characteristic squeak. His backpack hit the floor. "Mom? Why are you home early?" His voice carried that note of confusion that meant he'd noticed the pattern break. Mom was never home before dinner. Mom worked double shifts. Mom came home tired and quiet and sat on the porch looking at nothing. She couldn't speak. Couldn't form words that would explain what had happened without revealing everything she'd promised to keep buried. A tear slid down her cheek, then another, and she realized with something between horror and surrender that she was crying. Not silent tears. Actual tears. The kind that came from somewhere deep enough that she couldn't suppress them, couldn't control them, couldn't maintain the composure that had carried her through 20 years of classified operations and phantom service records. Her son had never seen her cry. She could see that realization move across his face like a shock. "Mom, what happened?" His voice cracked with something that might have been fear. She shook her head, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Just a bad day, baby. Just a bad day." The lie tasted like copper and regret, and she knew it wasn't good enough. It wasn't close to enough. He didn't understand. He couldn't understand. She couldn't tell him that she didn't exist, that everything she'd done to save lives had been officially erased, that she'd just lost her job for saving a man she'd pulled from a burning Humvee 20 years ago. She put her head in her hands and felt the weight of every decision she'd made to become someone no one could find. Her son stood frozen by the kitchen counter, terrified, not knowing what to do. This was outside the parameters of normal. This was his mother breaking in ways he didn't have language for. He backed slowly into his room, pulled out his phone with fumbling fingers, and did the only thing he could think of. He called someone who might know what to do. Someone who might know who his mother really was underneath the scrubs and the erased records and the lies by omission that had defined his entire childhood. The call came through at 6:02 a.m. Tyler O'Brien, 13 years old, standing in his 7th grade bathroom with his mother's service record printed from his school library computer, 4 pages of redacted text and official seals, speaking in a whisper to a number that had been disconnected for 20 years. "My mom won't tell me why she got fired. She just keeps saying it's complicated. But I found these documents. Navy. Marja. Senior Chief. I don't know who else to call." The voice on the other end didn't ask questions. It simply said, "What hospital?" 48 hours later, the Mercy General Board of Directors conference room filled with people who weren't scheduled to be there. Federal agents. Master Chief Warren in dress blues. A hospital administrator whose face had gone the color of old concrete. And Tyler O'Brien, walking through those mahogany doors with a showbox his grandmother had given him years ago, the one his mother thought was packed away in storage, the one containing the life she'd tried to bury. "Mom, they need to see these." His voice cracked on the word "these." The boy set the showbox on the polished conference table and upended it. The room didn't just go quiet. The silence became a physical thing, solid as a wall. A Navy cross fell first, hitting the table with the weight of decades. 2 purple hearts followed. Then a bronze star with a V device for Valor, the ribbon still vivid despite the years. The medals scattered across the table like coins from a sunken ship, and for exactly 3 seconds, no one breathed. The head nurse, 60 years old, 20 of those at Mercy General, picked up the citation with trembling hands. Her voice wavered as she read aloud, "For extraordinary heroism while serving as Senior Chief Petty Officer with Marine Forces in Marja." She couldn't finish. The words tangled in her throat. Extraordinary heroism hung in the air like a question that had finally found its answer. The door opened. Footsteps. A barrel-chested man in dress blues filled the doorway the way a Black Hawk fills a landing zone, all presence and purpose and the unmistakable weight of authority. Master Chief Warren. Salt and pepper beard. Combat decorations arranged in perfect rows across his chest like a map of 23 years spent in the worst places on Earth. I'm Master Chief Warren, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to JSOC Task Force 121. I was Senior Chief O'Brien's commanding officer in Marja from 2004 to 2006. He didn't ask for permission to enter. He walked to the table and placed his hand on the Navy Cross. This medal represents a classified operation in Sanjin Valley on March 14, 2005. A convoy was ambushed. 3 Marines pinned down. Fire from elevated positions. Incoming rounds cutting the air at, he paused, his voice steady as steel cable. I'm not going to classify the specifics, but what Senior Chief O'Brien did in 47 minutes saved 3 lives. One of them was a young private named Danny Hayes. Hargrove stood. His face wasn't just pale now. It was the color of a corpse, the color of all the blood draining away at once, understanding flooding in like seawater. He moved toward the door. His hands were shaking. His medical degree, awarded with distinction, hung in his office, suddenly felt like paper in a furnace. 2 figures blocked his path. Federal agents. Morrison and Chen, Healthcare Fraud Division, their badges catching the morning light coming through the windows. Dr. Hargrove. A word. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered with the casual precision of people who'd done this 100 times. Morrison opened a laptop on the credenza. We've been investigating Mercy General's billing patterns for 6 months. Phantom consultations. Inflated codes. Device company kickbacks routed through your private practice. The screen showed a spreadsheet with 47 rows highlighted in red. Dates. Patient IDs. Fabricated specialist visits. $18,000 just for Commander Hayes alone, daily consultations that never happened, procedures never performed. Chen held up her phone. You accessed personnel records at 11 p.m. 3 nights ago. Attempted to forge Ms. O'Brien's employment history. Very sloppy. Very desperate. Your keystroke pattern is distinctive. The administrator stood. The legal counsel stood. The board members stood, one by one, because they understood now what was happening. The mask was coming off. 47 patients. $847,000. 2 years of fraud distributed like poison through every billing cycle, every insurance claim, every inflated consultation code. You were defrauding Medicare using a comatose veteran, the administrator said, and the contempt in those 8 words was lethal. The handcuffs came out. Morrison and Chen moved with the fluid precision of apex predators closing on prey that had nowhere left to run. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The words echoed in the room like a funeral bell. Hargrove tried to speak. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. Master Chief Warren crossed his arms. Silent. Watching. The embodiment of every standard Hargrove had violated, every oath he'd twisted into a weapon for his own enrichment. Boots on tile. Click, 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 click. The agents walked Hargrove toward the door. They passed the nurse's station where he'd mocked Megan, made his public bet, thrown her chart at her feet like she was something less than human. 3 nurses stood frozen. One of them was the charge nurse who'd seen his face when he realized what had happened in Bed 7 at 3 a.m. No applause. No cheers. Just the terrible silence of institutional consequence finally working the way it was supposed to work. The elevator doors opened. The doors closed on Hargrove's face. Terror. Disbelief. The understanding that his world had just become very, very small. Megan sat at the conference table, still in her work scrubs, her badge clipped to her pocket, and didn't move. Master Chief Warren approached her slowly. He placed his hand on her shoulder, the gesture of a commanding officer to a subordinate who'd held the line when everything fell apart. Your service record is being restored as we speak. All classifications adjusted. The Pentagon is handling the paperwork. He paused. His voice dropped. You did good work in Marja. You did better work here. The Marine Corps remembers. Megan didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her composure, the same composure that had carried her through 20 years of invisibility, was now the composure of someone who'd finally been seen. 5 years later, late summer, 2029. An outdoor wedding venue north of Portland, the grass green from morning rain, string lights strung between oak trees, everything arranged with the precision of people who knew how to plan for contingencies. Tyler O'Brien in marine dress blues. 18 years old. His own service just beginning, following the only example that had ever truly mattered. The bride waited in a separate pavilion. Music began to drift across the lawn. And Commander Daniel Hayes, recovered, healed, the burn scar visible on his forearm as a permanent reminder of that night in a burning Humvee and the hands that had pulled him out, walked into the bride's ready room where Megan stood adjusting her dress. "Ready?" he asked. "I've been practicing my walk. Promised your son I wouldn't mess this up." Megan took his arm. "You remember anything from before?" Hayes was quiet for a moment. The sunlight through the canvas pavilion lit up the old scar tissue on his neck, relics of shrapnel and hemorrhage and the kind of wounds that shouldn't survive. "I remember the burning. I remember pain that felt like I was being torn apart from inside. And I remember your voice. You kept saying the same thing over and over, 'You're going to make it, Private. I've got you. You're going to make it.'" They walked down the aisle together. The corpsman and the Marine. 20 years between rescue and reunion, and now walking with the authority of people who'd saved each other's lives twice over. Tyler stood at the altar in his dress blues and saluted as his mother reached him. The reception unfolded beneath the string lights. Master Chief Warren was there, along with 5 other former team members, their presence a validation that no one had asked for but everyone understood. A private acknowledgement that Senior Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien had served with distinction in places that didn't appear on maps and had kept serving in places anyone could walk into without credentials. Megan danced with her son, and Tyler said something that made her laugh, a real laugh, not the careful version she'd perfected over 20 years. Across town, in a strip mall parking lot adjacent to a tax preparation service and a dollar store, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table in the late afternoon heat. His medical license revoked. His criminal conviction, 18 months federal prison, 5 years probation, $847,000 in restitution he would never fully pay. Now he sold supplemental insurance policies from a folding table, the same product he'd once wielded as a weapon of fraud, the same fraudulent schemes he'd used to destroy a woman he'd underestimated catastrophically. A customer approached. Hargrove stood, forced a smile. The customer cut him off before he could speak. "Aren't you the doctor who got arrested? The one who was billing Medicare for fake consultations?" The customer walked away without waiting for an answer. Hargrove sat back down. Adjusted his faded brochures. Waited for the next person who might listen. Nobody did. Back at the wedding, as the sun dipped toward the tree line, Megan raised her glass. Her voice was steady, clear, no longer hidden, no longer apologetic, no longer small. To the men and women who serve without recognition. To the sacrifices that stay classified. To the truth that eventually surfaces, no matter how long we bury it. Commander Hayes raised his glass. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. They drank. The camera pulled back, showing the celebration, the community, the restoration. And hanging on the back of Megan's chair was her old canvas jacket. The unit patch was still there, sewn inside the lining. No longer hidden. No longer necessary to hide. Just a woman who'd finally come home. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in second chances, in hidden heroism, in the people who serve in silence, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were? What would you have done in Megan's position?